Speaking today about an issue that has received, I'll argue, less attention and somewhat more limited attention, or attention of a more limited focus than it probably deserves. And that's segregation by economic resources in the United States. Similar to the figure that Michal showed us, demonstrating changes in inequality and academic achievement by income relative to differences in achievement associated with racial and ethnic background. The former type of inequality has sort of flown under the radar despite being a profound source of disparities in children's experiences. And a similar process, I think, has gone on in the public imagination around issues of segregation. When we think of segregation in the United States, we're most likely to think of segregation along racial and ethnic lines for good reason. There's a long, sort of historically fraught story in America of segregation by race. This initiative continues to cause major social problems in the United States. At the same time as our neighborhoods and schools have become somewhat more resegregated by race following major desegregation efforts in the 1970s. Our cities or communities have also become increasingly segregated by economic resources, though this receives, I think, somewhat less attention. In addition, when we think of, to the extent we do think about economic segregation, we're likely to think of effects related to the concentration of poverty in mostly urban neighborhoods in the United States, again, which is a particular problem. But it's not the entire story, and that economic segregation is a more complex issue than that. Neighborhoods, communities in the United States have grown increasingly segregated by income or wealth, depending on how we want to think of economic resources. And part of this growth and segregation is indeed due to increasing concentration of poverty across communities. But an equal and sort of symmetrical type of economic segregation has occurred over the last several decades in the form of increased concentration of affluence in communities across the United States. So in this figure, what we see is changes, when we think about it, sort of in the size of the top and bottom segments of each of these bars, which represent the proportion of families living in communities with concentrated affluence, defined by median neighborhood incomes greater than 150% of the overall median income of metropolitan areas, alongside increases in the share of families living in poor communities, those with median incomes below 2/3 the median income of the local community. And as this sort of polarization of neighborhood economic resources has occurred, it's come at the expense of middle income neighborhoods, mixed income communities that expose families and children to others from a variety, or sort of more walks of life, you might think of it. So from 1970 to 2012, you can see that the proportion of families living in economically segregated communities more than doubled, at the same time as the share of families living in these middle income communities shrunk considerably. Both of these types of economic segregation have important consequences for children's opportunities, and particularly the opportunities available to children living in poverty. We can see the effects of these various types of economic segregation when we sort of compare metropolitan areas. And here, these are two cities we've all probably heard of, I think. We're in one of them right now. I hope we've all heard of it. There are 4 lines on each of these figures, each of them representing a different type of economic segregation. The blue line on each figure represents the H index, which is an overall measure of sort of spatial inequality or inequality in the distribution of resources. It represents the proportion of families who would need to move to a different neighborhood in a metro area for the distribution of economic resources to be perfectly balanced. The orange line, the highest line on both of these figures, is akin to these 15% and 34% figures on the previous slide, the sum of the proportion of families living in concentrated affluence and concentrated poverty. If we just focus on 2012, the right-hand side of each of these figures, you can see Sacramento and San Francisco end up in more or less the same place, comparable levels of economic segregation. But if we look at the red and green lines, with the red line representing segregation of poverty and the green line representing concentration of affluence, the stories are somewhat different, where the city we're in now, in Sacramento, the story of segregation has been more about concentrated disadvantage. The proportion of families living in segregated neighborhoods defined by segregated poverty is consistently higher than the proportion of families living in concentrated wealth. Whereas in San Francisco, the relative sizes of those two populations have been more comparable since at least the 1990s. Through the 90s and early 2000s, in fact, there was more concentration of wealth than concentration of poverty in San Francisco. So overall, sort of macro level measures of segregation paint Sacramento and San Francisco, as two examples, as very similar cities with respect to the distribution of economic resources. But that overall sort of total amount of economic inequality is driven by very different mechanisms, and they create different opportunity structures for children living in poverty. And for children in particular, economic segregation is a major issue. Neighborhood economic segregation has been increasing faster for children than any other age segment of the U.S. population, and persists at higher rates than economic segregation among adults. When we take school districts as the spatial unit that we're considering economic resources to be distributed around, we can see that economic segregation between school districts has been increasing at an especially high rates from in the past 30 years or so. Families with children have become increasingly segregated across school district lines, with this being driven primarily by concentration of more affluent families in school districts composed of people like them. At the same time that school district segregation of affluence has increased, there's some evidence that school district level segregation of poverty has decreased somewhat over time, which implies more integration. Right? Segregation is decreasing, integration should be increasing. But it's important to keep in mind that if the wealthiest families are moving out of school districts, the type of integration that's occurring is of the poorest children with the slightly less poor children. Thinking about a lot of the processes that Nicole talked to us about just a few minutes ago, you can imagine that the segregation of affluent families away from school districts enrolling or that in which students from middle income, working class, and poor families live would have a number of consequences. In general, the sucking out of resources from those school districts can have numerous negative implications for students that, time permitting, I'll talk about in a few minutes. With this concentration of advantage among families with, oh yeah, time will not permit. We'll just skip ahead. So there's this between school district segregation, again driven primarily by the segregation of affluent families, is most of the story of the segregation experienced by children. About within a metropolitan area, 2/3 of the economic segregation experienced by children is driven by the clustering of affluent families in sort of their own school districts, leaving other families in separate district boundaries. But the remaining third is driven by segregation of more advantaged and less advantaged students within particular schools in the same district. And this sort of within school district segregation across schools has also experienced a marked increase in recent years, growing by 40% from 1990 to 2012. The causes of this economic segregation are numerous, manifold, but there are some key factors that seem to be consistent indicators or predictors of economic segregation. The most prominent is the rise of income and wealth inequality in the United States overall in recent years. These figures, demonstrated on the slide here from the work of Piketty and colleagues, demonstrate this fact that the highest earners have been enjoying an increasing share of the total income of the United States. in recent years. And this growth in wealth inequality is even more substantial among families with children. So you have more families of kids enjoying more disproportionate shares of income, using that income to secure educational and life course advantages for their kids by moving away from more mixed income districts to segregated or segregated communities. So the presence of children at the community level is a strong predictor of economic segregation at individual or family levels. By some accounts, Ann Owens at University of Southern California has work showing that all of the income segregation growth in recent years in the 100 largest metro areas in the U.S. is driven by families with school-age children. That if it weren't for families with kids with greater economic resources moving to try and attend homogeneous schools, there would be no change in economic segregation at all in the United States. Here's one I'll go pretty quickly through. So just as there are many causes of economic segregation, there are of course many consequences as well, some of which we've already sort of talked about. And I should just mention quickly that when we talk about the consequences of economic segregation for children, we're talking about the community level neighborhood effects alone. So this is accounting for differences in their families, differences in their individual academic achievement and things, effects that are attributable only to the neighborhoods in which they live. Indications are that segregation of poverty, so living in a poor neighborhood, is very strongly associated with intergenerational upward mobility. And on the flip side, segregation of affluence creates social problems as well, as the concentration of wealth and political power in these communities can pave the way for increasingly unequal distribution of other resources across families who share the same metro area. Another consequence, one that's somewhat more difficult to measure, is the potential severing of social ties across the income spectrum, as affluent families become increasingly concentrated in their own communities, separated from poor working class families. They simply lack the lived experiences and shared connections with those people, which can create a deterioration in what some observers call social empathy, or you can just think of it as a willingness to help other families. Policies like local control funding formula, I wonder what the consequences are. So turning over control of schools and school funding to local communities is very appealing in a number of ways, but if those localities are very unequal in their motivations and the children to whom they think of themselves as being beholden, I wonder whether policies like that will lead to an equalization or a disequalization of opportunities. Probably over my 5 minutes.
No, like 2 minutes.
Okay, so these other 2 points similarly indicate that neighborhood segregation net of family and individual characteristics are strongly associated with economic outcomes over the course of an individual's life. We learned already a lot about consequences of poverty for academic outcomes. College enrollment seems to be a particularly sensitive outcome to segregation in particular. And this may be due in part to some of the mechanisms that researchers have settled on as key factors linking neighborhood composition or school composition to individual outcomes. Things like school and teacher quality, peer effects, certainly play a role in individuals and children, adolescents, perceived opportunities, their aspirations and expectations for themselves. Similarly, the availability of positive versus negative role models in highly segregated communities can lead to differential life course outcomes. I think, Sarah, you're going to talk about some of these things, right? So I can do more skipping. The last thing I wanted to discuss was our state in particular, how economic segregation seems to be taking shape among young Californians. California, compared to other states in our country, has actually experienced less growth in economic segregation by many measures. In terms of raw numbers, because there are a lot of people living here, there are a lot of children living in economically segregated communities. Here, this is a map of Sacramento census tracts. The color codes here, each of the colors represented in Sacramento are sort of bad news colors. Purple census tracts are census tracts that since the 1970s have had greater than 30% of families living in poverty. The orange tracts are those that used to be low poverty in 1970, less than 15% of residents living in poverty that have since transitioned to being high poverty neighborhoods, and sort of the same story with the yellow tracts. What we would like to see is more green census tracts, which are formerly poor communities that have seen their poverty levels decrease below that 15% threshold. San Francisco has a few of these census tracts, the green ones. Los Angeles, only one green census tract, and lots of the bad news colors, the purple and orange and yellow census tracts that indicate increasing or persistently high levels of concentrated poverty. You can see that there's a sort of pattern to this geographic sort of distribution of resources that many of us are familiar with. Okay, I should stop. I should go over my list that I already have. Okay, thank you. I look forward to your questions and to hearing Sarah's comments.
Great. Thank you. And our discussant is Sarah Kimberlin from the California Budget and Policy Center. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That's a very interesting presentation. What I want to talk about a little bit is some of the policy implications of the information that Jacob presented about the trends in economic segregation. I think, and particularly in the California context, I think from a policy perspective, there are kind of two basic ways that you can kind of think about tackling this problem of economic segregation. So one would be to focus in on the mechanisms that that you started to talk about. So if the to identify what are the reasons why children who are living in concentrated low-income neighborhoods are ending up with worse outcomes. Is it because they're funneled into schools that have a reduced level of resources? If that's the reason, then a solution could be to direct more resources to those schools, like in the way that the local control funding formula does, for example. Or is it that their nutrition is compromised because those neighborhoods are more likely to be food deserts? Then there are policies you could think about that would encourage, the locating of supermarkets in those neighborhoods, or a reduction in fast food restaurants, or those kinds of things. So the one of the approaches you could take is to sort of look at the mechanisms and try to figure out what are the characteristics of these concentrated low-income neighborhoods that are producing these outcomes, or the characteristics of these concentrated low-income schools that are producing these outcomes, and try to address that by improving the resources available to those areas, or improving the conditions in those neighborhoods, so that living in that neighborhood or attending that kind of school is no longer a disadvantage, because you've equalized, without changing who lives there, without changing the composition of the incomes of the people who are living in that neighborhood or who are attending that school, you've adjusted the resources or the conditions so that living there with that particular composition of people isn't a disadvantage anymore. So that's, I think, in a lot of ways the easiest approach to trying to address those problems, because you can identify kind of discrete pieces that can be tackled. Of course, the alternative approach is to try to address economic segregation itself. And certainly there are ways you can do that through housing policy. If you're talking about economic segregation at the neighborhood level. So, I think if you think about it at the most basic level, a neighborhood will have a mix of incomes if it has a variety of housing units in it. So if there are housing units that are different sizes and that are different types, like renter and owner housing, small and large units, and if you have housing units that are have different costs, most importantly, that are affordable to different income levels, then you're going to produce a neighborhood that has a mix of incomes. It's dependent on what's the composition of the housing in that neighborhood. So if you're wanting to promote more mixed income neighborhoods, then you need to think about how to facilitate a mix of housing types or a mix of housing costs in a particular area. So there are a few ways to do this. You can try to layer on top of the existing housing stock different kinds of prices. So for example, you can make vouchers available to low-income families that reduce the market rate rent to a level that's more affordable. You can also have policies like rent control or Prop 13, which effectively create different housing prices for similar housing units in a particular neighborhood. Of course, a lot of economists will argue that that's not a very efficient way of approaching achieving a mix of rents or ownership prices in a neighborhood because of all the other external things that go with things like rent control. But it does on some level achieve a mix of incomes by changing the prices for the housing in a particular area. And then of course, like the most perhaps durable way to achieve a mix of incomes by having a mix of housing types is by approaching it when you're developing the housing. So, and this can involve features like zoning policies that facilitate a diversity of types of housing in an area. So multifamily housing, properties that are zoned for multifamily housing, near properties that are zoned for single-family housing, paying attention to the income levels of the surrounding area when looking at infill development projects to try to make sure that you're not creating a homogeneous neighborhood, but you're rather increasing the diversity of incomes in the neighborhood. Deliberately including housing that is of a variety of types or price points when you're doing, for example, transit-oriented developments or larger new developments where you have an opportunity to create a large number of units to make sure that those are not homogeneous, but there are different types of housing available at different kinds of prices. And in the California context in particular, the regional housing need allocation process also presents an opportunity to encourage more income mixing. I think it's often talked about as just as a mechanism to try to increase the absolute number of affordable units in California, which is obviously a really important need, but also it also is a mechanism that can increase the mix of incomes in particular areas by especially by encouraging areas that tend to have higher income neighborhoods and higher income, higher housing costs to co-locate lower rent units, which then will produce a larger mix of incomes and less economic segregation. And there are a lot of things that can be done to sort of increase the carrots and sticks for the regional housing needs allocation process to try to get more of that income mixing to happen through the development process. A similar kind of strategy is just paying attention to where subsidized housing is located. When plans are made for subsidized housing, attending to, is it located in a neighborhood that's already largely low income, or can it be located someplace that has more higher income residents, again, to try to avoid perpetuating economic segregation. So I think these are all different kinds of approaches that you can take to try to manipulate the mix or kind of encourage a broader range of incomes in particular neighborhoods. But I think there are still some areas where it would be helpful to have more data and more evidence. I think when you're actually trying to implement these kinds of things on the ground, sort of a more nuanced understanding of the different kind of features of economic segregation would be really helpful to understand. For example, the scale of income mixing. It would be helpful to know more about what are the benefits and drawbacks of having a mixed income within a single building or within a block, or within a neighborhood or within a city. Each of these things might address different kind of aspects of economic segregation. And they have different, it's much more challenging to develop a mix of incomes in a single building because the different financing mechanisms you have to use to pay for those different kinds of units. You're doing market rate housing as well as subsidized housing in one building, for example. So does that confer a lot of benefits that make it worthwhile to put in that extra effort, or is it just as good basically in terms of the outcomes you achieve to do two buildings that are next door to each other, or two buildings that are 5 blocks apart, or where the logistics of facilitating income mixing might be easier, or less expensive if it could achieve the same outcomes? That would be helpful to know. And similarly, knowing more about the specific mix of incomes? Like, is there an optimal mix of incomes that, or a minimal mix of incomes that helps you achieve the kinds of outcomes you want? So you're talking, Jacob was talking about how we've seen the phenomenon of affluent families moving out, so that you then have increased mixing of the poorest families with the poorest children with the slightly better off children. Is that enough? Or, I mean, is that, you know, how broad of a range is ideal? Does it matter if there are affluent families in the school or in the neighborhood, or is it enough to have poor families with middle income families? Maybe it's better to have poor families with middle income families than to have extremely low income public housing next to luxury condos, for example. But there isn't, I think, a lot of data out there saying, sort of identifying what it is that we would ideally be aiming for if you're trying to produce a mixed income community that's going to achieve better outcomes for children than an economically segregated community, while also accounting for the realities and logistics of trying to manipulate the availability of housing and the price of housing so that you can achieve that mix of incomes. So, thank you.
Thank you. Do you guys want to handle the questions? You've got one back there.
I was wondering if there's been any research, or if you're familiar with any research on the ability of dissolving school districts, so wealthier school districts with low-income school districts, and if that's changed the way resources have been distributed among the student population. I know from my personal experience in Sonoma County, there's about 40 school districts in our small county, and like literally you can tell the school districts that are drawn in low-income communities and specifically keep low-income communities isolated from higher-income communities. And I was wondering, like, well, what if we just like dissolve some of those school district boundaries and combine them so that they're forced to share resources with one another? And what would that do? And has that been researched?
Mm-hmm. So the scenario you're describing of sort of increasing fragmentation of communities by school district, so increasing the number of school districts within a metropolitan area is far more common than any sort of dissolution or combining of school districts. Kendra Bischoff, whose work I cited in some of these slides, has done work showing that over time, metropolitan areas that have seen increasing within metro area fragmentation by school districts are precisely those metro areas that have seen increasing segregation, increasing inequality in student outcomes. You can probably imagine, right, there's a general lack of political will to dissolve school districts that create those sorts of advantages for the already more powerful and affluent. And as a result, there's very little evidence of that happening that I've ever seen. It sort of doesn't happen. Things go in the other direction far more often. I don't know about California in particular, if you might know.
Education experts might know more about that.
Does any education experts know?
I can just speak to, in California, it really doesn't happen very often either. And a lot of times it's splitting. It's difficult to combine school districts. They've made different decisions. They bring different dollars to the table. It's a long process. But you're right, we've talked about it. Politically, it's very difficult.
Yeah, school district mergers in the U.S. will sometimes happen when population decreases to the point where having two separate low population districts becomes untenable and they combine for sort of practical purposes, but not for social justice reasons. Yes, in the back.
Because that was the strategy of doing it in the South, because Brown, the only way that you have desegregation was to take county-wide districts, but that's the standard, and that is why the South stayed segregated for much longer than the rest of the country, because of the county-wide school districts.
Yeah, I had a question. Obviously, when you start changing some housing policy, or want to put in development policies to promote integration, do you have examples within California where it's been done, you know, in a way that's considered sort of successfully in concert with the school district consideration? Because those things always, of course, bring up tensions between what are the school district boundaries and then, you know, where's the housing development going to be. So I was curious if we have examples of communities that did it well.
I'll say I don't know off the top of my head of examples in California. Others might. I mean, there certainly are mixed income communities that have been designed, like on the national level, that have been designed around school districts or magnet schools or those kinds of things. And one thing that I think is interesting about those kinds of approaches to designing mixed income communities is that it sets up a situation where you are drawing on the things that people have in common across income lines. So we're talking about the relevance of cross-income social cohesion and cross-income relationships. If there's a mixed-income community that is drawing on families with a mix of incomes, but what they have in common is that they all have children and that they want their children to attend a high-quality school, that could tend to promote a kind of community that would be more cohesive and higher functioning than some. I mean, sometimes there are also examples, again, that of attempts to develop mixed income communities where the social cohesion is really hard to achieve, perhaps because there's just not always a lot in common between the different groups of people who are there, depending on how the development is designed and who chooses to live there. So I think focusing around something that provides an opportunity for common ground, or social scenes, those kinds of things, I think is probably helpful.
I know that there are ways in which things like housing vouchers are more difficult to implement, but new analyses from the moving opportunity studies suggest that it works when it's targeted to families with younger kids. So although there was sort of mixed evidence for the efficacy of moving opportunities for adolescent children, the young children now are finishing school at higher rates and having better economic prospects post-high school. Would there be, in a way, to try and target this idea of building communities of common interest around the schools, if housing vouchers were targeted towards expectant and new parents in low-income communities to move them into mixed-income communities? Would that actually be a mechanism you think could action?
Go for it.
I mean, I think a lot of that evidence suggests that could be a really compelling population to target housing vouchers to, right? Is that the more the evidence accumulates that the younger the child is, the more benefit they get from living in a more advantaged neighborhood, both from the moving to opportunity experiments, but also from just the other mobility studies of that when children were younger, even if they're not, even for every additional year that the child lives in a more advantaged neighborhood, they have better mobility outcomes. Suggests that, that targeting vouchers to families with children would make a lot of sense. And I think it has also been shown to be, economically cost-effective as well by the time you account for the additional earnings over the lifetime of those kids. So.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I love the idea, and clearly, just let that happen. The evidence, right, is, I think, unequivocal that earlier intervention is better and these sorts of things. I'm trying to think of like a downside, and it might be that for expectant mothers in particular, the cost of moving, sort of becoming displaced residentially to an area with perhaps like fewer social ties and fewer resources to help with a new baby might make uptake more difficult. But if we could ensure the uptake, I think one of the many things I blew past was some of the evidence from MTO showing that there's like this tipping point where if kids can experience this improvement in neighborhood conditions before age 13, see all these huge benefits, but if you wait too long, it doesn't work anymore. So yeah, targeting expectant mothers might be a great way to do it.
Hey, so the increasing economic segregation from the 1970s through to 2010, it seems like that a lot of that would have to do with white flight and the suburbanization of the country. and now I think we're seeing sort of a re-urbanization trend. So do you see those trends continuing, or is there any recent evidence to show that these trends might let up, or is it sort of the housing stock that we've got dictates, that these trends will sort of continue or plateau?
I'll say briefly, and then you can speak to this. In recent years, metro areas that have seen continued suburbanization or like slower decreasing suburbanization are metro areas that demonstrate the highest rates of economic segregation. So it was definitely one of the key drivers and continues to be one of the key drivers of economic segregation. Those areas that have sort of this persistent development of suburban fringes around city centers facilitate that sort of segregation. And then
I was just going to say that I think it would be important to understand if the trends are the same for children as for the population as a whole. Because even if there's been increasing numbers of people moving back to cities, I think that the data presented from the Ann Owens data, for example, suggests that families with children have very different patterns of where they move, which makes sense if they're moving to access school districts. So I think also some of the re-urbanization has been the millennial generation who are just getting to the sort of childbearing age. So I think it may remain to be seen what the trends will look like as they have kids, if they'll stay in cities or if they'll move out. So
I think there's time for one more question.
So I'm just wondering, if it's possible that we don't end up with policy solutions that can reintegrate our communities, are people thinking about policy solutions that would make our non-integrated communities healthy, happy, sustainable places for children to live? I think about children who grow up as adults. Now I know them as people who grew up in rural migrant farmer camps. And they report their childhood as being really happy places. They didn't experience the discrimination that I did as a child living poor in a middle-class community. They didn't know that they were poor. They had food, they had community, they had family. I don't know what the research is showing their social mobility, but could you speak to that?
yeah, I think actually when I was talking about that there are two ways you can approach this problem from a policy perspective, I think that's absolutely correct. That there isn't. I mean, it's not realistic and it's maybe not desirable to make everything into a mixed income community or a mixed income neighborhood. There are a lot of specific benefits of living in a place that has strong social cohesion and has community networks and resources that are specific to the needs of the people who are living there. And so I think absolutely the idea of improving the conditions, so identifying what is it about living in a neighborhood that has concentrated poverty, what is it that actually creates the disadvantage, and trying to address those issues, I think is in many ways the simplest approach, because if you can identify the discrete things, if it is that the school district needs more resources, or if it is that there needs to be more investment in water, environmental quality, or public safety resources, whatever it may be, then you may be able to remove the disadvantages associated with living there, so that you've solved the problem. It's no longer, you don't have to mix incomes to address the problem. If the problem is that you just need more resources in that area. So I will say, one advantage of approaching it through a mix of incomes is that it can do things like equalize the tax base and those kinds of things that help make it a sustainable long-term approach. But that also gets back to the idea of what scale of mixing is ideal. Is it maybe that you don't need to mix neighborhoods as long as you mix cities, or you don't need to mix specific schools as long as you mix school districts? If it's a matter of equalizing resources, or that's where I think thinking about what are the mechanism and what's the scale that's needed to achieve to get the resources where they need to go and to remove the disadvantage is helpful.
Thanks very much.